So in this session, we're just going to start with some historical Marxism, Marx, the man himself, look at some of his life, kind of address what classical Marxism is, and talk a little bit about the revolution that he saw happening, which thankfully didn't materialize in many countries. And then we're going to move in the next session to something called cultural Marxism, which is kind of an evolution of Marx's original beliefs. And then the theories that have spawned out of that, including critical theory, critical race theory, and some of the vernacular there and some of the ideologies. So you're probably hearing words that are tied to these theories and ideologies and aren't even aware of what their root is. So that's part of the purpose for our discussion as well.
Karl Heinrich Marx, the father of Marxism, was born on May 5th, 1818 in the Kingdom of Prussia, part of the German Confederation.
His grandfathers on both sides came from lines of famous rabbis, but his own father had converted to Protestantism, given the barriers to Jewish involvement in society as full citizens.
In 1835, Marx left home to attend the university, where he became fascinated with the teachings of German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel.
He had a full and exciting life, but was captivated by these big ideas coming from Hegel about what determined the path of a society of human civilization.
Between 1843 and 1845, Karl Marx forged two relationships that changed the course of his life.
One was to his wife, Jenny von Westphalen, who came from the Prussian aristocracy. A happy marriage, 7 children. And the other was his intellectual bonding with Friedrich Engels, who brought to the relationship a set of experiences and knowledge that really opened Marx's eyes to new approaches.
In 1848, Marx and Engels laid out their concept of socialism in their most famous work, the Communist Manifesto. In their writings, they championed the worker and advocated a classless society that dissolved bonds between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie.
The Communist Manifesto is not only Marx maturing from a philosopher and economist into a revolutionary and an activist, it's also remarkably well timed. The ink was barely dry when a wave of revolution swept all over Europe. He was seen as so seditious that he couldn't find a home anywhere in continental Europe, and therefore exiled to London.
In London, Karl took a job as a European correspondent to the New York Tribune.
Writing for the American market, he naturally had to turn his attention to American politics to an extent. The crisis over slavery, the abolitionist movement, and ultimately the Civil War.
Marx went on to write economic and political works, including Das Kapital.
So that's a great video, but I think we'll stop it there, and we'll come back to some of the other information a little bit later. I threw this chart in at the last minute. I think it's always important to understand the founder of these ideologies. The context that they're born in and live in kind of helps you understand their thinking. So, like the video said, Marx was born in Trier, Germany in 1818. He was born to a Jewish family. They weren't devout Jews, but they were certainly ethnic Jews. They converted to Protestantism out of just sheer utility. It was so difficult in European society for Jews at the time that they thought it would help them succeed. So his father was definitely not a religious man. He was an Enlightenment thinker. He read Kant, Voltaire. He even agitated for democratic reforms in Prussia, which at the time was a kingdom. They had a king. Marx was definitely an atheist. His most famous quote is, "Religion is the opiate of the masses." So Marx, as the video said, Marx was a journalist and an editor for leftist newspapers. He considered himself a philosopher and a theorist. He loved to write fiction. He also wrote Faustian poetry, which is some very disturbing kind of dark imagery associated with it. The video seemed to almost idealize Marx, but he had anything but a pleasant family life. Out of his 7 children, only 3 survived to adulthood, and 2 of his daughters actually committed suicide. one daughter, Laura, and her husband actually committed suicide in a panic. So very difficult life. He was exiled from Europe. He was kicked out of Germany, then out of France, then out of Belgium, and eventually wound up in London, where he died a stateless person at the age of 64. So what is classical Marxism? Well, it's really kind of codified in the Communist Manifesto and also in Das Kapital. But it essentially is his ideology that's tied to Hegel's perspective on historical materialism. So Marx saw the entire world as a continual class struggle. And we'll get into more of the specifics of that perspective, but it didn't really catch on in Western countries. It absolutely did in Russia, and it was the catalyst for the Russian Revolution and Lenin's activity there. And then in China, North Korea, Vietnam, a handful of other countries with terrible consequences. Marx's influence, because no idea comes out of a vacuum, Marx's influence included Kant, Hegel, Rousseau, the great philosopher of the French Revolution, and then Darwin. So we really did enjoy Darwin's natural approach to natural history. And then Engels, who was his partner in crime. So the original concepts for the Communist Manifesto were kind of brewing in France. And so they didn't really originate in Germany or originate with Marx. And so the French Revolution had this obsession, Jacobians in particular, with radical equality. And anything necessary to create that equality in society was acceptable. So those concepts, even after the failed French Revolution, those concepts migrated into Germany through scholarly debate. And that kind of is the way it's happening in every country. Academia seems to be where these ideas are accepted first. So Marx considered himself a disciple of Hegel and Hegel's perspectives. And Hegel was admittedly attempting to replace Christianity with a materialist construct. So Hegel's famous dialectic is, you have a thesis, then you have an antithesis, and then you come up with a synthesis. So he saw that as Christianity kind of negotiating with the culture and then resulting in some blended form of non-Christian deist kind of religion. And so Marx took that a step further and actually decided to eradicate Christianity in all of his writings. So there are the dates for the Manifesto and Das Kapital. They were initially published not to a lot of fanfare. There was a lot of unrest in Europe at the time, and no one was really interested in his kind of revolution. But the basics are listed here: bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. Today, the term is oppressed versus oppressor. The bourgeoisie control the means of production, the factories, everything needed to produce goods. The proletarians were oppressed and they were commoditized. They weren't paid well. And that idealistic vision of pre-industrial age craftsmanship and bartering and that medieval construct was gone. It had been reduced to servitude through the Industrial Revolution. So that was kind of the setting that Marx lived in. And his perspective was the only way to resolve that issue or those issues was a radical change. And so that radical change was a revolution. His perspective was it would move through 3 different phases. The first phase was uncoordinated and incoherent. The workers would smash the instruments of production. They would burn down the factories. They would actually destroy the means of production to keep the bourgeoisie from controlling them. And then the next step was organization. They would begin to organize, create unions, create permanent associations, and continue the revolts. on a smaller scale. And then centralized warfare. So those small scale revolts and struggles would turn into a national struggle. And then that would transform the proletariat into a well-formed political party. At that point, no action was considered out of bounds. Violence was a baked-in part of the equation. So the oppressors were unworthy of rule, unworthy even of life in the new society. All notions of freedom and culture and law were jettisoned. Hegel and Kant both saw those things as constructs and not necessary for civilization. All private property, of course, was gone. All wealth was redistributed to the proletariat. The nuclear family was destroyed. Home education was replaced with indoctrination of children, and then religion was completely eradicated. And so you do see some of these points, even in Black Lives Matter's charter. The elimination of the nuclear family was actually a stated part of their goals. So we're beginning to see some of these repeated in modern day movements. So the revolution didn't happen, at least not in the West, not in the way that Marx envisioned. And why did that not come to pass? Well, capitalism didn't devolve into chaos. Marx saw capitalism becoming greedier and greedier until the proletariat couldn't even pay their bills, couldn't eat, couldn't survive. And at that point, they would pick up arms. Well, Marx didn't predict the rise of the middle class. He didn't predict the end of the Industrial Revolution or its morphing into this middle class of artisans and small business owners. And so in the West, especially, the cultural factors and that advance of the middle class kept those revolutions from occurring. However, in some countries where there was not a long tradition of liberty, where you didn't see Enlightenment principles played out, they became regressive. They embraced Marx's vision. And of course, there was incredible poverty and suffering. So Lenin's perspective for the Russian Revolution was that he was going to implement to the letter everything Marx prescribed. And that included the violence and the bloodshed. And Stalin after him, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot in Cambodia, Castro, and a handful of other Marxist leaders are accountable for more than 100 million deaths in the 20th century. And especially Pol Pot in Cambodia with the killing fields, their concept of year zero, where they eradicated all history and all vestiges of previous civilization, tore down statues, burned everything, and came up with a concept that time began with the Marxist revolution. So we went through that pretty fast. I did want to save enough time for questions. And I threw a few out here just as kind of conversation starters. But I'm happy to take any questions that you guys have as well. The first one was, what are the consequences associated with secularism and atheism that Marx embraced? And I believe those consequences were kind of played out in what was written down in the Communist Manifesto in Das Kapital, and in his concept of the elimination of religion entirely. The societal problems that Marx saw, that he experienced, were real. So the poverty was real. The Industrial Revolution created, horrific poverty, child labor, the inability of the lower classes to, almost the inability to survive. The 20th century Marxist revolutions didn't make that any better. So, Vietnam, Cambodia, even in Leninist Russia, the proletariat's condition didn't really improve. The ruling party became rich, but those at the bottom of the societal ladder still starved. And then the church in Marx's era. So this is something that I really hope that we could focus on and pull through to the current day. So in Marx's time, the church was undergoing what the Germans called Kulturkampf, which is German for the culture war. And so that culture war was really between the Catholic Church and German Protestantism. And the Protestant churches within Germany were definitely moving toward progressivism and liberalism, more focused on social issues, social justice. The Catholic Church pushed back against that very hard. And Chancellor Bismarck decided he needed to pass legislation to control the church, control the Catholic influence, and to kind of regulate church activities. And that resulted in an attempted assassination on him by someone in the Catholic Church. So I would say that the church in Marx's era was absolutely dysfunctional, that it was engaged in its own culture war, that it was unable to speak to the real societal issues that actually were the fertile ground for Marxism. And so it's maybe too much to speculate that it could have been avoided, but had the church been more active and spoken out more against these ideologies as they were emerging from France and moving into Germany, that maybe this could have been mitigated at least. So I believe the church in Marx's era kind of bears responsibility. And I would hazard to say the church in our era is bearing some responsibility for the resurgence of these ideologies. And not only are we a little hesitant to speak out about them, but in some cases, churches are actually embracing the language of these ideologies.